Okay, good morning. Good morning to you all. Hello. Yes. I'll just wait for you to settle down, shall I, before I start? Okay. Okay, so my name is Chris Perryman. I'm a British national, formerly working for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs in London. And I now work for an organisation called EUROPOL. EUROPOL, based in the Netherlands, being the European Union's law enforcement agency to assist the member states in the fight against organised crime and terrorism. Now, I've been asked today to come and give you a presentation for 45 minutes or so concerning the latest situation in the carbon credits frauds that some of you may, or some of you may not, have heard of. There is no real latest position in the carbon credits frauds. The latest position is that those that have perpetrated the carbon credits frauds are now beginning to face justice. So although my presentation will cover that to a degree, it will also cover what these criminals are doing now, where they're going, and how this organised criminality is causing such a threat to the European Union. For those of you that don't know what Europol is, I have a few statistics and things for you up front of the presentation. Also, to try to assist you in the round table that will follow my presentation, I'll be trying to pose a couple of questions aimed for you to consider as a group, but also for perhaps the participants in the round table to consider and maybe come up with some solutions that I, as a law enforcement officer, can see that may affect the smooth running of the public prosecutor. Okay, so the presentation will cover an introduction to Europol. It will then cover an introduction to VAT fraud, as that is what I do. We're looking at the evolution of the frauds since the carbon credits. And then we'll look at one particular case outline of probably, well, it is the biggest pan-European VAT fraud that is currently ongoing, the JIT Vertigo. Okay then. It's not working, Sebastian. Excuse me, technical error. It down. Okay, there you go. It is working. I'm the one that's the technical error. Okay, so Europol itself then. The goals for the next 4 years up to 2020 is to try to establish Europol as the criminal hub of information that the law enforcement community know they can come to, a central agency that has the mandate, the infrastructure and the legislation to allow secure interchange of intelligence to a central point that can be then distributed to investigators across the EU. We supply support not only in providing that infrastructure, but also having analysts on site that will be able to undertake specific tasks as laid down by the investigators to assist in that investigation. Now, it's important for you to listen to the words I've just said. Assist in the investigation. Europol itself has no mandate to identify targets and arrest targets. We do not commence investigations. We do not take over existing investigations. Although our analysis and our findings may assist the identification of targets, but the member states themselves have the remit, the authority to determine whether or not they wish to pursue those lines of inquiry. So it's an agency that the member states come to for support rather than an agency the member states give the cases to and wave goodbye to. So we're fully in the line of supporting these things. We get involved in cases where the serious criminality affects 2 or more member states. Okay, that's the serious, that's the definition that we look at in serious organised crime. So if you have a group that is conducting major VAT frauds only within your own country, that would not become part of the mandate for Europol. So it's the pan-European crimes that we're looking at. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I'm going to have to, I need your magic finger. Oh, he's only got to be here. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so this is the luxury hotel from which I operate. It's the headquarters of Europol in The Hague. We do have officers seconded at Interpol in Lyon. There's also an officer out in Singapore. Interpol have an organisation out in Singapore which looks at cyber threats. And we have some liaison officers also based out in Washington, D.C. Those are the Europol employees. But at Europol, there's more than just Europol employees. In fact, we have one sitting in the third row back here, Nina, who no doubt you've all met by now. Nina is a customs officer from Germany, but she is also the on the German Liaison Bureau at Europol. She is not a Europol employee. She is employed and paid for by the German customs to work at Europol to ensure that the German customs get the most they can by using the facilities and the potentials and possibilities of Europol. So she works there, she's not a Europol employee. And there are many more like her. There's approximately 150, forget about the numbers change, there's around about 150 Europol liaison officers there at the moment. But they represent 38 countries. Now you will know, of course, that the European Union only consists of 28 countries. Yes, it is 28 at the moment. I know I'm from the UK, it's going to become 27, but it's 28 at the moment. So that means there are countries outside of the EU that are represented at Europol, because countries outside of the EU recognise that there is a good opportunity for them to assist their cases in Europol. And in total, approximately 70 agencies are represented. The name Europol suggests a police organisation. It is not. It is a law enforcement organisation. I, and indeed Nina, are both customs officers, law enforcement officers in our own country. But we'll have border guards, we'll have immigration staff, we'll have intelligence officers from some of the anti-terrorist brigades in there, not necessarily always police. It's a law enforcement organisation. The other thing to remember about the Liaison Bureau is that although the working language at Europol is English, the Liaison Bureau speak your language. So if you, again using Nina as an example, the Germans amongst you here, if you have a case and you want to discuss the possibilities of how that might work at Europol, you can pick up the phone and speak to Nina or her colleagues in your native language and they will assist you. So there is no reason not to use it if you're a German-speaking customs officer, because the facilities and the infrastructure is there to facilitate that. Fingers crossed. It's still not working. What is it with this button? Welcome to my world, Sebastian. Okay. So I mentioned that there were these other countries there, and they have various means in which to operate. There's essentially two types of agreement that countries and entities can sign with Europol. We have what we call strategic agreements, which allows intelligence of a strategic nature, so modus operandi, routes, etc., to be shared with Europol. And then we have operational agreements, and the operational agreements allow signatories to share personal data with Europol and vice versa. So that means that data that comes into us can go to countries outside. The wonderful map here shows the countries in blue, being the European Union member states. The countries which are shaded in yellow are those with strategic agreements, and the countries in orange are those with operational agreements. So you can therefore see that Europol has operational agreements, the ability to share personal data with countries as far afield as Colombia, Australia, and also the United States, to name a few, and Canada, to name a few. The lists are all up there. They have officers appointed at Europol. It's in one building, and people can go up and down the lifts to go and speak to one another, and it's a highly effective exchange of information. I say all this because when we come to the debate later on about the European Prosecution's Office, it's good for those involved in that process to know that Europol is effectively a one-stop shop for the exchange of information. There's a slight caveat in that Europol does not actually own the data that is stored within Europol. The data that is stored within Europol is owned by those contributing the data, and those contributing the data outline to Europol how that data can be used. And there's what we call a form of handling code. Each piece of intelligence that arrives has a handling code assigned to it, which allows, which indicates to the Europol staff how that intelligence can be used. And although the majority of the intelligence that comes to us allows us to share that intelligence with the relevant member states, there are occasions where sometimes the intelligence may be deemed so sensitive by those providing it to us that they restrict our dissemination of that until we get a specific permission from the member state to do so. But in essence, this is a one-stop shop, and in essence, this is a place where intelligence can be shared. Press the button, please. Thank you. I mentioned VAT, and Chantal touched on a VAT figure earlier on. VAT. So the last report that came out from the European Commission showed that the tax gap, the VAT tax gap, that is the difference between the money that is expected to be collected by the member states and money that is actually collected by the member states. The VAT tax gap, 151.5 billion euros. Now that is not all fraud. That would include figures of monies not paid for bankruptcy, insolvencies, general non-payment, and errors that are not considered to be fraudulent. The fraud figure within that can be anything between 40 to 60 billion euros, depending on which report you read and depending on what particular acts the man or lady writing that report wishes to grind. 151 billion euros. This is driving me up the wall. I don't know what's happening with this. Yeah, okay. VAT as a collection is around about a fifth, 20% of total government revenues, equating to around about 1.5% of gross domestic product of the EU. The 2015 tax gap equates to roughly almost 13% of the theoretically expected amount of money. So just think of your own income. Just think if 13% of that money did not come into your pocket, what would have to go wide? What wouldn't you be able to pay for? And of course, this is money for schools, roads, hospitals, all that infrastructure that tax collection should be paying for that isn't being collected. As you would expect, the bigger countries contribute the most in terms of the quantity of the tax gap, whereas some of the smaller countries account for the greatly more damaging levels of tax gap. So we've got Romania, the tax gap is 37%. 37% that they're not collecting. Whilst Sweden virtually collect everything. In fact, shows you how statistics can be manipulated. The official Swedish figure is minus 1.92%. That is to say, Sweden are collecting nearly 2% more than they should be, which is interesting. Maybe they're collecting some of Romania's. Maybe that's how it works. Okay. Can you just be the beautiful reader? Oh, it is on that one. This is the interesting stat, though. 151 billion euros not collected. The figure to run the EU, 145 billion euros. In other words, the tax gap from non-collection of VAT is greater than the cost of running the EU. That puts it into some sort of perspective. That is why the European Public Prosecutor considers that the damage that's being caused is damage to the financial interests of the EU. And I won't go into the battles that have been run in the courts up till now on that point. But that is why VAT fraud, MTIC fraud, is considered so serious that it will become part of the mandate of the EPO at a specific level. I think we're looking at 10 million euros is a suggested level, but we'll see how we go with that. Is it this way? Oh, right. So at Europol, we decided to do something about it. I, as I told you before, was a customs officer working in London, in the UK, for HMRC. And I was asked to come on secondment to Europol and help set up a team called an analysis project this week, analysis project MTIC, which commenced in 2008 with the objective to collect, collate, analyse intelligence and information with the aim to identify organised criminals or networks active in MTIC fraud. We're not here to assist tax gathering, we are here to assist criminal prosecutions and therefore the EPO when the day comes. 23 member states are part of the membership with, I'll read all those, with 3 associated members. One notable member state you will not see up there is Germany, but I can assure you that Germany are probably the key provider to our work file at the moment, because although the Ministry of Finance has some issues about largely concerning taxpayer secrecy, the Ministry of Finance has some issues about joining us. Certainly when the cases come to the prosecution level in the Länder, the prosecutors have realised that there is an invaluable source of assistance and direction and analysis that can be gained from us. It's gone the other way again. This is a nightmare. Apologies for this. This is a bit thing. Okay, so one of the things I was meant to talk about was carbon credit fraud. And the French have actually turned, they refer to this fraud as the crime of the century. Why the crime of the century? Well, this on the screen here is a press release that our team made at the end of 2009, which suggested that in the 18 months up to the end of 2009, the tax loss alone was 5 billion euros only in relation to carbon credit fraud. 18 months, okay? Crime of the century. It's not just Europol that have come out with this. It's been the subject of many press releases in many countries, and many investigations have taken place in that. What is carbon credit fraud? Well, basically, it is a fraud against a system that was set up to try to clean up the planet. Carbon credits relate to a system of permits which were allowing the polluting industries across the EU to try to reduce their emissions. This was all in relation to the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol tried to set targets for the EU to reduce its emissions. The Commission then set up a system that all polluting industries had to register within their own countries, and they were therefore, there was approximately 12,000 of these industries, and each industry was given an allocation of quotas to cover the emissions it would make into the atmosphere. And the idea was that for each ton of CO2, carbon dioxide, you released into the environment, you had to possess one carbon certificate, EUA, called European Union Certificate of Allowance, which allowed you to put a ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So obviously if you released 1,000 tonnes in a year, you needed to have 1,000 of these certificates. And at the beginning, if you did not have the coverage of certificates, the Commission would levy swinging fines on you, heavy penalties. So at the beginning of the system, each registered industry was allocated a free amount of quotas, okay? Some of the more greener industries found they had more quotas than they actually needed, whilst some of the older industries, which perhaps hadn't brought up-to-date regulations and things into their factories, or in any case were emitting more into the atmosphere, found they did not have sufficient quotas. So therefore a market was set up to buy and sell these quotas, so that at the end of the year, those that required extra quotas could buy them from those that didn't need them, they were in excess. But just in the same way as company shares, any individual could register to buy and sell those quotas speculatively. And each member state had its own registry where those that wished to trade in these particular certificates had to register in order to buy and sell these quotas. And what happened is that the fraudsters found an opportunity here, because the tax authorities in their wisdom decided to charge VAT on the domestic purchase and sale of quotas, and the international purchase of sale and quotas, the cross-border sales, would fall to the VAT cross-border rules, which those of you that know or get involved with VAT find there is no VAT on an intra-EU transaction. So, he said, So, what was happening is, number one, the fraudsters would register in a country on their register, allowing them to trade. This would be an online trading account. They would then look to see where they could buy quotas from outside of the country from which they'd registered. Buy those quotas, bring them into their own registry, sell them to another registered entity in the country that they were registered. This would normally be via a broker. They would get the VAT from that sale, that domestic sale, and not declare the VAT to the government. That, in essence, is what was going on. And when we released the press release, a number of countries obviously decided to take stock of how they were managing that system. The Danish registry was the first one that was targeted en masse by the fraudsters, and the Danish registry decided that they would canvass their 1,300 registered entities for more information about why they were registering. All they had to do, all people registering for the Danish registry had to do originally was to provide their name, email address, maybe telephone number. That was it. But the Danish registry decided to implement more know your customer regimes, gave the 1,300 registrants a date by which they needed to register, with the threat that if you do not provide us this detail, we would cancel your registration. When the due date came along, there were only 130 registrants left. A 90% drop of registrations. Let's look at what was happening in France. In France, who were the country that had the major problems in the first instance, all the trading was done on a marketplace called the Blue Next. And in the summer of 2009, the French realized there was some massive problems going on, that the levels, the volumes of trade had gone through the roof, fraud had been identified as taking place there. They shut the market for 3 days. And during that time, they introduced new legislation in France that would take the VAT out of the domestic transactions. It was called a reverse charge derogation that they brought in. When they reopened the market, after introducing this reverse charge, which would take VAT away from the sale, which would therefore not give the fraudsters the opportunity to have and to steal that VAT, when they reopened the market, the trading volume had decreased by 90%, the same proportion as the Danish registrants had. Other member states followed the French example. Spain, Netherlands, Belgium and the UK all took either zero rating or reverse charge action at that time in the summer of 2009. But it left an awful lot of EU member states that did not bring that reverse charge or zero rating into their legislation, and it merely meant that the fraudsters focused their attentions elsewhere. So you may or may not have heard of a German case called Operation Odin. It's the case that if you do pay any attention to financial press, you'll see that there's an allegation of Deutsche Bank involvement, not as an institution, but individuals working there that have been charged subsequently. But the carbon credits arrests in Germany that have associated the activities within the German exchanges didn't take place to 2010. And after those arrests, the legislation was changed to take the VAT away from the transaction. That then had the fraudsters focusing on the Italian markets, because the Italians didn't bring in a zero rating or a reverse charge until, wait for it, the 1st of January 2015. Right? So that's nearly 6 years after the French took the action. And the fraudsters focused on the Italian situation. There were two major Italian operations, Operations Green Fees and Vitopoli, which targeted fraudsters because they hadn't brought in the change. So another thing perhaps for the EPPO to look at is that where member states have problems in VAT matters, that any legislation that comes in should be for the bloc and not for individual member states to undertake. Because all that happens is the fraudsters go to the place that doesn't have the deterrent. Think about neighbourhood watch in your area, or if you've got a big dog, burglar man goes next door. Okay. Again, this is something which will interest those of the EPO. What we did at Europol to try to counter this is to set up a group. We called it a target group. Target group Mistral, we called it, set up in November 2009, which was to share intelligence between the investigators who were looking at carbon credit frauds. And there were 11 member states that had criminal investigations at that time that joined that group. There may have been more member states that had criminal investigations that didn't join the group, but there was 11. Had the EPO been in existence at the time, this might have been good ground for them to perhaps pull some of these prosecutions and to take some action across a wider field. Okay? Two other associates in there, Norway and Portugal. Norway was very important because of the money laundering, and I'll touch on this a bit in the Vertigo discussion. And Portugal, who had a criminal investigation but was sort of half in, half out. But nevertheless, there was some opportunity here, perhaps, for some of these investigations to be run and conducted collaboratively. There were only one or two I can remember that were, and we're very, very lucky to have in the room a judge that was enlightened enough to take that step. Mr. Clare's here. Belgium and France had a joint investigation team that was available to people at the time, where they could run joint investigations against the targets. But I'll talk more about that target in a moment. But as an opportunity not perhaps taken up. The cases, because these countries had signed up to this target group Mistral, that obliged them to give Europol data on their cases. And the Europol analysts started to look at what was happening with this fraud. And we were finding that the frauds, the larger frauds, were basically controlled from outside of the European Union, which is another thing for the EPO to consider, because this is still happening. The frauds aren't run from inside the EU, they're run from outside the EU. And in this instance, Israel was a key point, but certainly Dubai. And we were getting intelligence from local sources there, indicating who was conducting this fraud and how they were trying to run the frauds. Although the geographical territory of the lead men was outside the EU, there was very much EU nationals that were running the frauds. So it tended to be French origin with Israeli connections using Israel as a base, and it tended to be British, Pakistani and Indian, Asian groups operating from Dubai. And as you can see, the immediate connections linked into the various countries in the Mistral group. But of course, when you went further, you found that the networks just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because they do. And a lot of them cross over. In VAT fraud, you do not tend to have nice little ring-fence frauds that once you arrest that group, that's the end of it. You have almost like, you know, multi-limbed octopuses wandering around Europe with their tentacles into everything. And things cross over, and you can soon get into analytical situations of that particular nature. A little light relief for you now. This lady, if any members of the public have crawled in, is not an MTIC fraudster, all right? I just like her. That's why she's on this screen. This is Shilpa Shetty, who is a famous Bollywood actress. And Shilpa Shetty happens to be married to a guy called Raj Kundra, who was at one point the 198th richest British person in Britain. Made a lot of his money through these pashmina shawls that he'd managed to introduce everywhere throughout Europe. In 2009, he became the CEO of a company based in Dubai that was trading in precious metals, construction, mining, and green renewable energy products. Now, any of you that know MTIC fraud know that precious metals, construction, and green renewable energy products have been subject to some fraudulent activity. Maybe we should be paying a bit more attention to mining, I don't know. But anyway, he was in that particular area. And he decided to write a book at the end of the day. This is the quote coming up. And this is the press release for the book, okay? It's called The Heston Principle. And it says, based on a true story, The Heston Principle is the exciting fictional debut by Raj Kundra. 3 young men from a dreary London suburb, aren't they all, decide to cheat Her Majesty's revenue to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds. This is a press release, okay? Their game is beautiful in its simplicity. By using ghost companies to import and sell mobile phones, and by taking advantage of the VAT reclaim system, the founding members of the Heston Principle are able to pocket millions and disappear into the ether over and over again without ever getting their hands dirty. From a rundown warehouse near Heathrow to the posh clubs of Chelsea and yachts in the Caribbean and then back again, the novel brains behind this mega scam, his sidekick and partners in crime, Mike and Aziz, a formerly upstanding lawyer who masterminded the whole thing. The only problem with the trio's game is just how well it works. It grows so quickly they can hardly keep up. And the Russian mobsters they've called in to help manage the cash flow are only going to complicate matters. Either this guy has got the most fertile of imaginations, or he's pretty close to maybe someone that's got more than fertile imagination. But that threat at the end, the Russian measures, make you think about it. Something else, perhaps, that the EPPO might want to think about. Those of you that are accusing me of being sexist by showing a photograph of this lovely, not an MTIC fraudster lady, right, will want to see this photograph. There's one for the ladies here, right? And he is a lovely, totally fraudster man. And I can say that because he has been convicted last month. This guy is a chap called Cyril Astruc, who has the alias of Alex Calm. And this guy is the target of Mr. Clares, who was involved in the carbon credits fraud. And indeed, Mr. Clares and his colleague, Judge Daef from France, came to Europol in the summer of 2013 to have a meeting with the Israelis. If you remember, I said that the French were using Israel as a base. Meeting with the Israelis to try to get them to assist the Belgians and the French in a carbon credit fraud. this resulted in a premises search in Tel Aviv, I believe, in 2013, where a Europol officer was present with Belgian and French police officers. Were you there as well, Mr. Clares? Yeah, he was there. He was there. He can vouch for this. Sorry? Peter de Pelt was our guy, yeah. So we had European law enforcement operatives in Israel, which coincidentally does not have an operational agreement with us, but in Israel to oversee the premises searches by the Israelis of this man's property. This man, Alex Khan, eventually decided to return to Europe. He returned to Europe on the 9th of January 2014, where he was promptly arrested by the SNDJ in France at Roissy Airport. He was placed under, he was on bail, and when he had this photograph taken, he had an electronic tag on his leg. Okay, so he was under monitoring. This photograph is from a publication called Vanity Fair, which you must have heard of. Vanity Fair, this is an interview he conducted in August 2015, and the interview is entitled Catch Me If You Can, and it details how he operated. Now, I've brought a copy of that interview to here, and we're hoping to get it copied up for you. It's in French, but it will be available for you when it gets photocopied for you to read. It tells you all the story of what's going on. But anyway, the French case ran from April 2008 to March 2009. It was for 146 million euros. The Belgian case was a similar time span. In fact, it didn't run as long as that, 73 million euros. And the Belgians managed to actually recover 67 million euros of that straight away. So that is a terrific result. There's only 6 million euros left. So in total, therefore, you're looking at over 200 million euros damage his gang had come up to. And on the 13th of September 2017, the 37th Correctional Chamber in Paris conferred a sentence on him of 9 years and a €1 million fine. Now, 9 years is almost the maximum in France for such a crime. €1 million fine is certainly the maximum. The whole group between them there was 12 of them, had total sentences 54 years and €6 million in penalties, in addition to the money that they will have to recover from a result of the fraud. A thing for the European Public Prosecutor's Office to think of: these crimes committed April 2008 to March 2009, gets his sentence September 2017. That is not untypical for an MTIC fraud case. I've got examples myself in the UK, having arrested people in December in 2006. The trials were concluded in 2012. The major pan-European frauds take a long time to investigate, a long time certainly to defend, and the material that's gathered is problematical as well. But that is an excellent result, with a major criminal taken down, and he's now starting his particular crime. The French are now, whereas I mentioned the 5 billion euros that Europol came up with, the French are now claiming that their losses between 2008 and June 2009 are 1.6 billion just for France, and they're admitting to that. Those of you that follow academics, there's a guy called Dr. Marius Christian Frunze, who is a lecturer at the Sorbonne. He's written an excellent book on Alex and his cohorts called The Carbon Connection, which explains how they've done all this, names all the individuals in there as well. Very, very well-researched book. He considers the Europol estimate to be conservative. He considers it's possibly double that. I'll move on a bit because I think I'm delaying things slightly on this. What I said is that different countries had different prosecutions, and this is worth looking at, and this is worth looking at it from the European Public Prosecutor's perspective. The German Operation Odin, this is the one that involved the Deutsche Bank that took place after France, Netherlands, Spain, Belgium and UK took out the VAT. A conspiracy between August 2009 and April 2010. Remembering August 2009, the French brought in the legislation in the summer of 2009, so straight away the fraudsters went to Germany. Approximately 850 million euros. That's the admitted to figure. We think it's higher, but that's what they're saying. 6 men sentenced, British and French nationals, as well as German nationals, with prison sentences ranging between 3 years and 7 years, 10 months. The French operation, Nathaniel, which is another one, there was about 25, 30 of these investigations, but I've just picked on this one. A 43 million euro VAT fraud in 1 month in May 2009. 5 men sentenced between 1 and 5 years. The UK had a prosecution called Tulip Box that ran for 8 months in 2009, 38 million pounds sterling, it's round about 43 like the Nathaniel one. The sentence is there, 9, 11 and 15 years. Now there's some questions here, there's some observations to make. Number one observation you could make is do not mess with the British. I'll just lay that out there for you, all right? Just do not mess with them because the sentences are miles higher, all right? It's a comparable fraud to the French fraud, and yet, you know, the French maximum is 5 years. Obviously, the Germans in the middle. Alex Kahn, we've seen, has got a higher sentence than the maximum. But straight away here, you've got different sentences which are applied at different member states. Now, much in the same way as the fraudsters moved the carbon credit targets to countries that did not have the legislation, it could well be that once they start, once the EPO comes in, that this might influence where they set up their areas. The other thing, of course, is that there are currently 20 member states that are looking at joining the EPO, and certainly 2 of the member states, are Netherlands with 1 and UK, are not part of this proposal. So it could be that maybe the fraudsters somehow might want to operate there. Just leave that there for you to consider. I'll just dash through this. I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on this, but what's happened is the fraudsters, when the carbon credits opportunity dried up because of the legislation, they then started to look at the wholesale energy sector. And this is a particular case, Operation Stromkreis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, which was a case that did go through to court, which we managed to demonstrate clear links between those conducting this fraud and those controlling carbon credits frauds. At the end of the day, we got some sentences in 2012. Again, 3 years, 9 months down to 2 years for a massive fraud. Some of these people were arrested at the bottom here. 3 were arrested in the UK in April 13, and they weren't actually extradited until 2014. Another thing maybe for the Public Prosecution's Office to consider, that this was arrests under European arrest warrants properly, and it still took a year and a half to get these people out of Germany, and certainly by the end of October 14 they were still appealing against the process. Okay, it's another thing to think of. But they moved on to wholesale electricity. The last thing I will cover, because this is the major crime that's going on at the moment, is the JIT Vertigo. And this is a press release from Europol. If you go onto the Europol website, you can see all these things. There's been 4 major action days, 3 in 2015. This is the press release from the first one, and 1 in 2016. And who knows? There might be another. Who knows? What you will see in the middle there, though, is at this stage, 150 million euros was the estimated crime. Having arrested the first wave of people and having examined material uplifted from the first wave of people, that figure has now gone up to 320 million euros. Okay? This is the damage to the JIT participants, who are Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Czech Republic. The Netherlands is interesting because the Netherlands had a case against the money laundering aspects of this particular group, and the money laundering aspects did not involve the use of conventional banks in the way we know it. It involved the use of something called alternative banking platforms, which is another day and a half of presentation if you would allow me to stay here, but I've got about 2 minutes and counting, I think. So I won't go into that. But that was an insight into how fraudsters are using technology to create bespoke banking software which is passed between them and their members only to move money between one another. And all of this is outside the regulatory oversight of the banks. There's no telltale sign from the bank that the banks can see of money coming into an account and straight away moving out to another account. Money still goes into correspondent bank accounts, but bespoke software allows the fraudsters to move money between themselves in sub-accounts that they have set up and that they orchestrate through the internet. And only they and their cohorts know the internet passwords. And this is the problem we're up to today. So you'll see money going into a correspondent bank, often outside the jurisdiction of the EU, and then money going out from that eventually. 4 member states involved in this, as I said, but the other states involved in the actual activities, Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, Germany, Denmark, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, third country, Poland, Romania, Spain, Sweden, Slovakia, Switzerland, third country, UK and Cyprus. Then we've also got Gibraltar and Ukraine. Another thing for the EPO to think about, that the people conducting these frauds are not confined to the EU boundaries, and they will use the succour and facilities of people outside. Europol has had a couple of operational meetings prior to a JIT being formed, Joint Investigation Team, to try to identify connected cases. Once there was a joint investigation team, of course, the application is made through Eurojust, and you've had presentations on this to now, have you? Joint investigation teams and Eurojust? Yeah? Have you had? You have, right, okay. About 100,000 in that. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, indeed. Many cooperation meetings, and as I say, up until the end of 2016, there's been 4 coordination days run at, I'm getting the hang of this, running at Eurojust. The end of 2016, this is, to say, the biggest European case at the moment, but it gives you an idea of the numbers you might be looking at. So, just in the 4 countries concerned, 318 suspects. Currently, at the end of 2006, 114 had been arrested, both within the EU and outside the EU. Some trials had gone on, a total of 130 years imprisonment, the highest being 10 years. 5.1 million euros is seized, not a patch on yours, Mr. Clares, but also outside the EU, including in Hong Kong, which actually is no mean feat. And number of seized of goods. The goods in this instance are electronic goods, iPads, PlayStations, etc. That's the things that they're currently looking at. But massive numbers, massive logistics, massive geographical spread, massive involvement of numerous agencies and authorities that do not speak the same language, have different laws, have different sentences, have different practices, have different outcomes, are allowed to do different things in different countries depending on where it happens. That's the end of my presentation. I'd be very interested to see how the European public prosecutors will eventually react upon this. And I look forward to hearing a very interesting roundtable. And thank you for your perseverance with my technical inadequacies and for your attention. Thank you.